Hi, welcome to a new episode in the Internet Surfer, hosting the most horror and creepiest stories from Reddit. Please don't forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy.
What is the scariest/creepiest thing you have seen/heard? Scariest, creepiest, and horror stories from Reddit. Episode 2. Growing up, I lived in the middle of the woods. No neighbors for about a mile on each side, and we owned 60 acres of forest, then a swamp after that. So basically, I lived in the middle of nowhere. One summer when I was about 14, I was out in the middle of the woods playing with my dog. I'm an only child and both of my parents were out of town, when I kept feeling something hit my elbow. I'd go to throw Max's ball, and the bump would make me throw it almost straight up. Assuming it was just me bumping it on trees or something, I ignored it. After the fourth or fifth time it happening, I thought, well, this suck, I'll just go home. Walking back, I felt uneasy, but I knew I was just freaking myself out because we were alone. About an hour later, Max and I are at home on the couch when the garage door opens and he starts barking. I hop up to go let in my mom or dad, even though they were home really early. I peered through the peephole and saw the door was still shut and no one was in the garage. Quieting Max down, I opened the door slowly and called out for my dad. Nothing. No response at all, so I went out to check the door and it was still locked. Okay, sure. Weird, but oh well. Max heard it too, so at least I know I'm not crazy. About 20 minutes later, I hear the door open again, and this time Max starts growling like crazy. I quiet him down again and just assume it's the wind or something making noise, even though by this point my heart is racing. I hear footsteps coming up the stairs and think, oh geez, Dad really is home this time, and hop up and run to the door. It starts to jiggle, so I run faster to let him in. I peep through the hole, and even though my hand is loosely around the jiggling handle, there's no one on the other side of the door. Terrified, I go to hide on the couch with all the lights on. Max is still growling. About an hour after that, I start to feel a little better, even though I'm still terrified. Then I hear the door handle jiggle again. This time it was Max jiggling it. He needed to go outside, and the only way outside was through the garage. Fantastic. I literally sprint with him to the kennel, and as I'm standing in there, I decide to ask this question to make myself feel better, because I knew it wouldn't answer me. Thinking about what to ask it, my eyes are drawn to the huge heavy oak door on the kennel. It was always open because it was too heavy for me to move easily. I said, okay ghost. If you're real, you'll shut this heavy door. Nothing. A minute goes by, nothing. Max is still sniffing around. I turn around to yell at him to hurry up, and then from behind me I hear, click. I whipped around and saw the giant door had swung shut and latched. Okay, clearly it was just the wind. It wasn't really windy, but it was the wind, for sure, had to be. I proceed, okay ghost, that was the wind. If you're really real, you'll open this massive door back up. Nothing. I relax a bit and then squat down with my head on my knees, reminiscing about how lame I just was being scared when I heard click-clack. The door was now wide open. Max was done, so we booked it back into the house, locking every door in the house. For the next 4 hours I would hear the footsteps on the stairs and the door handle jiggling every few minutes, until finally around 11 p.m. my dad walks in and yells at me for wasting electricity. I never told him or my mom about it until about 4 months later, when my dad came in from hunting after dark. He looked shaken and I asked him what was wrong. He said he aimed at 2 deer but missed both completely because it felt as if something was hitting his elbow and making him shoot way above the deer. That's when I told him everything. So, I'm from a small country in Central Europe. Loads of people have probably never heard of it. It combines a small patch of the Adriatic Sea and Alps, but the landscape is mostly small green hills, each with a little church on top. Almost 2/3 of the land is covered with forests, and the capital is famous for its middle-aged architecture. It is an adorable country in which most of the time nothing really happens. Like most of the population, I live in the countryside. a few hundred meters apart from my closest neighbor, right next to the forest. I spent most of my childhood in that forest. I can still remember which the best trees for climbing were and where certain flowers grew. But the thing I will never forget happened in the summer of 2001. I was just around 12 back then and I was spending my whole afternoons in the forest. Most of the time I was roaming around with my best friend, but that day I was alone. As I said before, most of the land around here isn't flat. The hill behind our house is quite steep. Right above our house is an old orchard my great-granddad planted, and when you come to the top of the hill you can almost see the capital city in the distance. Then there is big forest that extends across the karst landscape practically right to the Italian border with a few smaller towns and villages in between. I never really went extremely far because I mostly stayed in the area my family owned, but that day I decided I wanted to see some more. I didn't have much with me and I didn't tell my parents I was going anywhere far. I always felt very safe in the woods even though bears were often seen in the area. In reality the most dangerous thing you can bump into are drunken hunters. Forest is pretty in the summer, leaves and tall trunks made me feel like I'm in a big cathedral. I started to sing a tune I have heard on the radio some time ago. At that point I was about an hour and a half walking distance away from home. I decided to stray away from the main road that leads through the forest in big curves and to take the shortcut. Sun was setting and light was making leaves glowing in sharp colors. But soon all the light disappeared, and I found myself wandering in the twilight on territory unknown to me. Wind was blowing and dry branches were making weird noises. I started to feel uncomfortable. And in one sheer moment I discovered I was lost. I could feel panic in the form of adrenaline that started to flow through my veins. My instincts were screaming to run away, but I forced myself to focus and tried to get orientation. It was all pointless, I had no idea where I was. I started to walk around aimlessly, hoping to at least find the road. Suddenly I saw a small figure standing far off in the distance. From what I saw it could only be a small child, with a long slender neck, scaly but smooth skin and deep red eyes. I started walking towards it, but the figure noticed me and ran away. I chased figures in the forest for quite a long time. I never came enough close to actually distinguish any of its features, but it looked like I was a small girl, no older than I was at the time. In one moment, I was running and in the next the floor under me disappeared. I felt that dreadful feeling of falling, similar to one in unbelievably bad nightmare when everything feels like slow motion. Then that awful sound of my body hitting the floor, a moment later also came the pain. For a moment I motionless lied on the ground, finally I pulled myself together and opened my eyes, waiting for them to adjust to the thick darkness in the cave, where I landed. First everything was pitching blackness. And then I saw. There was a single pair of eyes staring at me, for less than a few inches in front of my face. I quickly backed away, until I hit something dry and crumbly. Somewhere in the back, fires were lit. First there was one, and then increasingly, until the chamber was fully lit. There were thousands and thousands of eyes watching me. Dead eyes in dry sockets, skin that was stretched over the bones, mouths hanging open like in big shock, but that was only because lips rot in the time that passed. I stared, I wasn't able to move or scream. I am not even sure I was able to breathe. I blinked, hoping for the dreadful image in front of me to disappear. As I opened my eyes all otherwise motionless corpses moved. In the matter of fact, I didn't really see them move, but when I blinked it was like everything got one step closer. I felt cold sweat slipping down my neck and my eyes began to water. I could help myself. I blinked again. This time, I was completely surrounded. I simply closed my eyes, wishing for it all to be just a bad dream. I didn't hear a single sound. I smiled thinking that soon I would wake up. When I opened my eyes, there was a face, almost touching my face. I could clearly see dried and rotten faces, eyes filled with numbness. I started to feel dizzy. I felt something like dust and bones grabbing my hair and tearing my clothes. I felt it and I didn't feel it because I became so dizzy and sick. I tried so hard to stay conscious, to fight, but I couldn't move a single muscle. And then it was again pitch blackness all around me. I opened my eyes, trying to adjust to the lack of light. I was lying on the forest ground, not so far away from home. In that exact moment all my body started to function normally. I ran home like a wind. I had no idea how I got there, and I just tried to forget about the whole thing, but my peace didn't last exceptionally long. Next night I dreamed about people I saw back there. I woke up to the face looking at me from the window. It was the face of a little girl. She was also dead, and her empty eyes watched me with wild anger as she was clawing the window, trying to get in. I have had the same nightmare for the past 12 years. At that time, I visited many different therapists. They say it is just stress from school and my job, that I should try to relax. But how can I relax, when every night as I open my eyes, a girl is one step closer to me? One night she finally got close enough to mutter just one sentence to me, "I may need about tree fiddly." It was at that moment that I realized this creepy female figure off in the distance was 500 feet tall and from the Paleolithic era. In the middle of the summer 2 summers ago, I was sleeping in my bed peacefully when I heard the loudest thunder I've ever heard in my life. Normally I am not afraid of thunder, but this time my entire house shook as if it was a huge earthquake. I shake it off and go back to sleep. No big deal. Next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a flash of bright purple lightning and the loudest thunder that Zeus could possibly create. Then I started to hear the screams. It had seemed as if outside my window was a choir of demented hell-spawn screeching in cries of agony. As I lay in bed terrified, I thought to myself, this is actually happening. I can hear them. This is how it ends. Later I found out that the screams were just a pack of foxes that were scared by the intense lightning, but still that was some scary stuff right there. Up until I was about 8 or so, I lived in a really old house that, since the beginning of time, had been bounced around from relative to relative until eventually my mother had been handed over the keys. It was basically heap. 2 stories, a collapsed balcony on the 2nd level, mold and mildew all over most of the ceilings, one tiny bathroom and the toilet was outside, overrun was frogs and spiders and whatever other kind of hellspawn the Australian outback would throw at us. I was terrified as a child, scared of basically everything. I'm much better now and have much bigger balls than most of my friends, if I do say so myself. Nonetheless, I would probably have to put the blame on this old house of mine. I remember as a child that I would always have the same dream. I'd start in the kitchen, no idea how I got there of course. It was during the day, probably later in the afternoon. Nobody was around, so naturally I'd go looking for my mother and father. I'd go to all the normal places. Mom wasn't in the laundry shed or the lounge room, Dad wasn't on the patio outside or up the back at the chicken coop, and my sister wasn't around either. I was starting to get worried, thinking that everyone was gone, and they'd left me alone. Until I heard a noise above me coming from the 2nd floor, where the bedrooms are. Relieved, I darted towards the stairs and jumped on the 1st step. Then I felt it. There was something in the back of my head, making me stop, legs still raised up as I prepared to move on to the 2nd step. Something telling me that I shouldn't go up there. Of course, this thought was running rampant in my mind, don't go up there, don't go up there, stay down here, don't go up there, there's something up there. Finally, my leg dropped before I could reconsider. I pushed myself up those stairs, and even though I didn't want to anymore, I couldn't stop myself, only slowed down. Each step up was taken at an agonizingly slow pace, and I wanted so badly just to go back downstairs and find someone, run to my grandparents' house and stay with them until my mum was home. But eventually, I rounded the corner, leaving only the last few steps leading up to the floor ahead of me. There was nothing there, I couldn't see anything in the stairwell. I started getting hopeful at this point, maybe it's okay. Nobody's here. I was just imagining things and it's going to be fine. I'm still taking the slow steps up when it appears. Something's there. I can't actually remember what it was, and I never could after I woke up. But it was horrifying, unbelievable, and I would always try to close my eyes, because that was my thing as a child. If you can't see it, then it can't see you. But I could still see it. I couldn't blink, I couldn't shut my eyes, it was like my eyelids weren't working. I would even try holding my hands in front of my face, but still, I couldn't block it out, I could see through my hands. And I couldn't do anything, I was frozen, unable to do anything except stare at this thing all but a meter away from me. Whatever I saw, whatever I did, for those 8 years I was at that house, I had to force myself up the stairs. Day or night, it was horrifying. My mother sighed and tried to reason with me, my father growled at me and called me a coward, and my sister just laughed and said I was retarded. But every time I had to go up those stairs, as soon as I hit the top stairwell, I had to stop and make sure that I could cover my eyes with my hands or that I could shut my eyes. Of course, it would terrify me most when I'd go to blink and wave my hand in front of my face, and it wouldn't work, and I'd realize I was dreaming. Edit, oh wow, comments and upvotes, my word, what a wonderful day. Thought it might be interesting to add that once I moved out of this house, I never had any more of those dreams, though I was terrified of my house in general. I couldn't be alone in it until I was about 15, and every morning before school I'd basically run out of the house from my room and wouldn't feel safe until I was out the door and on the front lawn. I worked at 2 hospitals, placement, during my last year of college. At one hospital I worked with professionals that did therapeutic play with children on the pediatric ward as well as on the adolescent psych ward. At the other hospital, my boss and I would do crafts, projects, art, etc. with the teens to help them have an outlet while they were getting treatment for mental illness, addiction issues and other medical issues. Each day, before we would see the teens, we would get a rundown from the nurses on the ward explaining who everyone was, what issues they were being hospitalized for and any other info we needed. This could include anything from a warning that the patient had violent tendencies, how they are adjusting to being on the ward, which patients they did or did not get along with, etc. So, this one night, we were given the usual rundown of the teens on the ward, and the nurse mentioned one teen in particular. This girl, I will call her Sally, obviously not her real name, had all of a sudden just stopped talking one day and started to act really out of character. She would not respond to family, friends, siblings, doctors, or anyone for that matter. She was hospitalized because they became concerned about her harming herself, and they were definitely trying to ensure she was being watched 24/7 just in case she was experiencing some type of psychosis. I don't know a ton of details because we were just given a quick rundown of the patient's case. From what I was told, they had checked and ruled out brain tumors and other possible physiological causes and found nothing abnormal. Now, just to set the stage, this hospital is an incredibly old hospital with dark hallways, poorly lit rooms, and the coldest, creepy atmosphere I have ever experienced. In every way it looked like a hospital you would see in a horror movie, and when walking down the hallways, I remember always being scared something would jump out at me because there were a lot of blind spots due to its incredibly old layout. Anyways, tonight in particular my coworker/boss and I started the crafts and activities for the kids in the kitchen room where we always did our activities. I was sitting close to Sally and tried to initiate conversations, but she would just stare blankly. My boss/coworker tried as well, and Sally would not respond, and without warning she would just occasionally look at us and laugh loudly or smile at me with glossy eyes. The doctors had tried all day to get her to speak and she said nothing, so I just chatted and tried my best to include her even though she wouldn't really engage. I started to doodle on a piece of paper while talking with some of the teens and just randomly wrote down, "Hi," and drew around it, not even really thinking about what I was doing. Almost immediately after I wrote, "Hi," Sally picked up a pencil and wrote, "Hello." I was shocked to say the least. I was the first person in days and days that she attempted to communicate with. I didn't know if it would work, but I wrote, "How are you?" and she actually wrote an answer. I was blown away. After Sally and I exchanged a couple questions/answers, my coworker noticed what was going on, so she kept the other teens busy and just nodded at me to keep going. Within a few minutes, this girl and I had written almost a page of conversation, and she was communicating through writing with no trouble. I couldn't believe it was happening. I was getting all this info from a girl that everyone thought was unreachable. We talked through writing for what seemed like hours, but was probably just about 1 hour, and while I was asking her about how she was feeling about being in the ward, she admitted through writing that she was scared. I pressed on, trying to see if she was scared because she was in a strange place or missed her family etc., but she wrote it was because she saw people in the room with us. Obviously, there were people in the room with us, so I asked her why the people in the room scared her and she simply wrote, "They are dead." I swear, when I read, it felt like my stomach hit the floor. I looked up from the page we were writing on and she just looked at me and then turned her head and stared at the door. No one was there. Well, at least, I didn't see anyone there. Sally stared at that door for a minute, and I swear she saw something there. I was more scared than I could even express. I will never forget the look on her face. Whether or not there was a person/ghost there, Sally could see someone. I took some deep breaths and once I had her attention again, we started communicating again through writing. We talked this way until 9 p.m., when I had to leave with my coworker/boss. I thanked Sally for speaking to me and she seemed a lot more aware when I said goodbye. She still was not verbalizing, but I know that the doctors were going to do their best to find out why. I collected the papers we had written on and before leaving the ward showed the entire conversation to my coworker and the nurse in charge. Everyone on duty, nurses, etc., was dumbfounded that I had actually communicated with her, and they assured me that the pages would be passed along to the psychiatrist the next morning. I was filled with so many emotions. I was happy I had spoken to her, and she was honest with me, but I was also still incredibly scared and shaken up. My coworker dropped me off at home and I remember walking into the living room and my roommates knew immediately something had happened. I was shaking and blurted out everything that happened. They were supportive but also freaked out by the situation. I have never been happier to have roommates because if I had gone home to an empty place, I probably wouldn't have slept for days. One morning at about 1 a.m., I got a phone call from my little sister's cell. She lived in a time zone to the east, so it was 2 a.m. there. It woke me up, and I immediately sensed that something was wrong. I picked up the phone and groggily said, "Hello," when I heard a muffled woman's voice, possibly my sister, say, "Please, help me." She sounded terrified and desperate. I immediately thought I was having a taken moment. My sister is being kidnapped/tortured, and it was all she could do to call me for help. Should I hang up and dial 911? Should I yell into the phone? Should I keep listening and try to pick up some kind of relevant information? I really wished I had one of those fancy phone recording devices that the taken guy had right then. I opted to keep listening, and as I did, I occasionally heard muffled yelling and screaming, much to my horror. Her phone must have been hidden away pretty well. Then something strange happened. I heard my sister's voice was clear, also muffled, but completely calm. I didn't hear what she said, but it was a very casual, conversational tone. Then I noticed for the first time that there was also scary music along with the yelling and stuff in the background. I used to have a truck that I swore had the ghost of a dead baby in it. I used to get home late from my job as a dishwasher, and after I parked and was sitting in my driveway with the engine off, I would hear this really faint sound of a baby crying. Late at night when it was quiet, it used to make my arm hairs stand on end. I used to get home and hop out of the car in fear of hearing it. One night I decided to sit there and just listen, try to pinpoint the sound. Eventually I discovered that it was indeed not a dead baby, but when I undid my seat buckle the old spring of the seatbelt retractor would slowly start pulling the belt in, creating a faint noise that sounded like wailing. Bobcat screams in the middle of the night. We have a house on the lake with a decent amount of wooded property, so we get all kinds of wildlife roaming around. Can't see any houses around us, no streetlights, so it's pitch black woods all around us. We were there with some friends last weekend, playing some cards around midnight when we heard a bobcat. It sounds like a ghostly woman screaming in the night. Our dog started going nuts trying to get out. Definitely freaky when it's coming from pitch black wood. I don't know about the creepiest ever, but recently I had a good scare. I was out camping and spent an extra day at the campground, so I was the only person left. Great big field, one tent. The park owner even offered to refund my money if I wanted to leave, but I was there on my own specifically to get away from the hustle and bustle, and I stayed the extra night. I finished a novel I was working on and decided to finish the night playing Call of Cthulhu on my iPad. Not really scary, but it sets a mood, you know. I fall asleep and wake up to something poking me in the back. I lie there, poke. It's in the middle of my back and I can hear it scraping the bottom of my tent. I look around without moving. My neighbors had told me about seeing some venomous snakes and I'm worried maybe something crawled in to get warm. I finally decided that it must be under the tent itself. Poke. I sit up and the thing shimmies out from under the tent into the woods. For all I know it was a chipmunk or mole or something trying to keep warm, but it did give me a scare. My cousin had a child about 8 years ago. My great-grandmother, very beloved woman, all-around great person. My grandma Shaver passed away while his wife was pregnant, and only about 2 weeks before she was due. This was important for a few reasons. My cousin would have been the first of his generation in my mother's side of the family to have a child, therefore would have been my grandma Shaver's first great-great-grandchild. 5 generations alive at the same time, it would have been pretty cool. But she passed away from a stroke and it was very tragic. Fast forward a couple of years. My cousin and his wife are showing their daughter family pictures. She's approximate 3 to 4 years old at the time. Asking her, who's this, and seeing if she remembers names of aunts, uncles, grandma/grandpa etc. They sort of skip over a pic of my grandma Shaver, and she puts her hand on the pic and says, "That's Grandma Shaver." My cousin said he was a bit uncomfortable, but asked, "Do you remember hearing us talk about her?" And according to him, his daughter looked him right in the eyes and said, "No, but she visits me and talks to me all the time." He said he didn't sleep right for a few weeks. Good thing we're all sure if she is a ghost, she is probably the kindest gentle ghost there is. Still, creeped me out. I've been on a tour at an old prison and some of the scariest stuff I've ever experienced has happened there. I'm not convinced in ghosts and whatnot, but if there are, they're definitely there. Every other person who works there has their own creepy story. My scariest was when I had a group of about 30 people in the gallows one night, the room where people were hanged, and the room is made of corrugated tin, so I was there doing my bit when suddenly there was this huge bang on the roof. Everyone looked up and a few people screamed, by a lot laughed. We have a few actors that jump out on tours, so they probably thought it was that. The banging didn't stop though, it was kind of irregular at sort of like half-second intervals, like boom, boom, boom boom, and people we are getting creeped, me included. So, I took the group outside. Now the roof of the room is a slanted frame, so if you walk back a bit you can see the outside roof. We all watched as this one bit of tin looked like it was being stomped on from the outside, moving, everything, still banging when I took the group to the next spot. We finished off the tour and a few people thought it was a joke, but it genuinely terrified me. When I was a kid, my parents went out one night and left me home alone. We had a bunch of cats, and we fed them all in separate rooms with the doors closed to keep them from stealing each other's food. My parents had fed them, I only had to let them out. I went to the back of the house to let out Playful, who ate in the room directly across the hall from my bedroom. When I opened the door, there was blood everywhere. His food dish was about a quarter filled with it, and there were bloody paw prints on the floor near the door, but not a speck in on my cat. I checked his paws and his mouth, there was no blood on him at all. When my parents came home they checked him over and weren't able to find any explanation either. I used to work night shift security on a college campus. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., usually by myself. If I were lucky, I'd have a work-study student officer with me until 2. The campus had been around in one form or another since the Revolutionary War. Started as a wood fort, then stone, then finally a concrete fortress with dozens of brick buildings until the end of World War II, when they decommissioned the fort and turned it into a college. There's one building on campus that used to be an officer's quarters, a really fancy, rather upscale 3-story house. The place has all the classic ghost stories, lady in white, shadows moving on their own, footsteps, etc. I never believed them. Until I experienced them. Temperature drop. My first experience there, I was still on second shift, during the day. It was maybe 4 p.m., I remember the sun was still out. It was also in the 80s outside. I was crossing the main lobby, a large room in front of the double staircase, when I realized something. It was suddenly too quiet, like the air was heavy and pressing down on me. I stopped walking for some reason. Then it got cold. Really cold, it must have dropped about 20 degrees. Needless to say, I booked it before I heard or saw anything. I've seen horror movies, hate this. The scream. Another experience with this place, screaming. I was escorting a couple of new officers to show them how to lock the building. We were standing in the lobby, everything seems to be focused there, talking to the last guy in the building. 4 of us, standing in a group, when all but one of us heard it. Shuffling. Like something being dragged in short spurts across the floor directly above us. Scrunch hey. A woman screamed. But there was nobody up there. I wanted to check it out, but the female officer I was next to was too creeped out, cough. The child laughing. It must have been a few months after the scream incident. I hadn't gone through there much since then. I was escorting another new guy and had just finished telling him the story about the scream. We were standing next to the back door. Once again, this room was directly connected to the lobby, with a rather large arch connecting them instead of a door. As we started walking into the lobby, a familiar feeling crept over me. It was quiet, and heavy. That's when we heard it. I'm fairly sure I heard the pitter-patter of little footsteps, but we both heard it. A little girl. Giggling. On the floor above us. The building was empty and already locked up, we were doing second checks. There was no way somebody else was in there, the previous patrols would have found them. We looked at each other. Welp. Booked it out the door. The woman in black heels. This one is the last thing I experienced in that building. In fact, it's the only thing I saw outright. I was working alone that night. There were still 2 staff members in the building, one in the basement, one at the front desk. As I was locking the doors, they were finishing their tasks and getting ready to leave. I double-checked the building, turned off some lights, and started crossing the lobby when I looked up the staircase. The staircase runs parallel to the lobby, it goes up half a floor to the landing, then the rest of the way in a switchback setup, like this, but with another set of stairs on the other side of the landing too. There was a woman up there on the second floor. All I could see was the bottom of a black skirt, her legs, and black heels. Walking from the right to left. She was wearing heels, but there was no sound. And even though she was walking at a regular pace, I blinked, and she was gone.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.